Ladies and gentlemen, please give a welcome to Chris Brett, who is the Vice Chairman of the Nelson Society. Good afternoon, Chris.
Hi, Alistair. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud
Good.
and clear.
Hi.
Thanks, and thanks for the lighting and everything. You look good there.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you.
it's a real pleasure to have you on the show, Chris, and to give us what I know is going to be an extremely fascinating discussion about the truth of Nelson and the truth of his claimed connections to the concept of slavery and the practice of slavery. But we'll get into that in a little while. Um, could you just please begin by perhaps introducing the Nelson Society to people who haven't heard of it before? You know, what's its purpose?
Sure. We're a registered charity and we've got about 500 members. And the society, I think, as you point out, was founded some time ago. We actually celebrated our 40th anniversary on the 28th of November. Um, our mission really is to raise public awareness of the achievements and the life and times of Admiral Lord Nelson and his Navy. And we try to achieve that in a number of ways. You very kindly pointed to the Nelson Dispatch Journal. We undertake um, a good amount of research. We publish the journal, we publish books, we hold meetings, we sponsor good Nelson related causes. Um, and really, that's what we're about, trying to raise awareness of the life and times of Admiral Lord Nelson. And if I can just put a quick advert in, of course, people can find more information on our website and our Facebook page.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, let's put your website address up there. The Nelson
Okay.
Society, Nelson society.com. And I had the privilege several years ago of addressing the Nelson Society when you came up to Edinburgh for the Copenhagen dinner, I think it was called.
Yes.
And I spoke there about Nelson's connections with Scotland. And not many people know, but the first ever monument to Nelson after Trafalgar was put up in Scotland at the Bonawe furnace by the workers who worked there who made the cannonballs that helped the Union win the wars, as they say. And the the next one was, I believe it was the one in Glasgow Green, which actually went up about 40 years before the one in Trafalgar Square. So there's a real strong connection with Nelson in Scotland as well. And of course, many of Nelson's sailors also from were also from Scotland. And um, have you, as an organisation, been impacted in any way by the what's the best way of calling it, the kind of statue controversy that has been around in the last 18 months or so, that kind of built up during the time of lockdown? Lots of strange things came out of the woodwork, one of which was that whole issue. Have you, as a society, had hitherto had much problem?
I think it's fair to say we've had a great problem with it. Nelson is one of the most written about, researched historical characters. I think at the last count we found over 1,250 books about Nelson, um, and there's never been any suggestion in any of those books to date that Nelson was, as has been alleged, either racist or pro-slavery. And I think it's fair to say that when this issue first started, we were rather shocked. And if I can just perhaps show you this really started for us in at the end of 2017, when a journalist for the Guardian, Afua Hirsch, published an article saying toppling statues. Here's why Nelson's column should be next. I don't know what. Let me see if I can get that up so that you can see
Yeah,
that.
I can see that.
And
Yeah.
so pretty sensational stuff, which was immediately followed by, would you believe, Historic England publishing the same sort of imagery. There we are. And their reason for doing so was that they wanted to stimulate the debate about historic characters and their role in the slave trade. I don't know whether you'd like me to explain the problems that we have with this, because our constant battle is with what I would call lazy history or bad history. And that bad history is very often colonized, as you quite rightly said, by groups which have particular agendas. Now, we're not saying that those agendas are wrong, but when you use Nelson and use bad facts about Nelson, or in fact misinformation, to support your case, then really we can't stand by and let that go unchallenged.
Absolutely, that's correct. You can't. So yes, please do kind of explain how Nelson. Well, you've showed how Nelson has come into this debate, and what sort of things was this lady Afua Hirsch alleging that was going on.
Yeah, I think whenever I talk on this subject, people must think I'm actually obsessed by this lady. But this is that we can trace the starting point of this whole debate back to her article.
Right.
And basically, and I'll quote this if I may, she accused Nelson of using his seat in the House of Lords and his position of huge influence to perpetuate the tyranny, serial rape, and exploitation organized by West Indian planters, some of whom he counted amongst his closest friends. Now, you'll appreciate with our mission, which is to raise awareness of the life and times of Nelson, we were pretty shocked by those allegations. They're heavyweight, and they're heavyweight, aren't they? In any time, any if people were making those comments today, it'd be horrifying.
Well, what's associated with serial rape?
Serial rape, tyranny, exploitation.
Talk about using your what are these words called? Like these. Talk about hyperbole, for crying out loud. It's just beyond the pale, and they throw around that sort of stuff. Throw around hyperbole, and you're suddenly caught, and it's like, well, I've got to defend a serial rapist. I thought I was talking about Nelson. Before you know it, it's, he's a tyrant. I didn't think he was a tyrant, and suddenly they move the conversation from just like objective normality to something that's just way out there crazy. And
I think
it's
that's
very
exactly
often
right.
Very often difficult to engage with that. And so, well done for attempting to engage with that. What was the next move?
Well, what I was going to say was that the beauty of statements like that is that we can test them. We can look for the good history. So, for example, we know, I think it was in 1801, Nelson was elevated to the Lords. He visited the Lords on a number of occasions, but we have records of what he said. And he spoke only on 6 occasions. So her allegation that he used his seat in the House of Lords can be tested. On those 6 occasions, he only spoke about matters that he was au fait with, largely military matters. So we can put a cross against that comment. He didn't use his seat in the House of Lords to perpetuate tyranny, serial rape, and exploitation. Okay, so that's the first way we challenge it. The second is slightly more difficult in a way, because she said he used his position of huge influence. Now, in many respects, we know that Nelson was an influential figure. But when you look at the history of Nelson, he only became influential in a real sense, probably in 1797. He fought at a battle called the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, which is very often memorialized on the columns and that we've been talking about. At that battle, he managed to capture 2 Spanish ships by boarding them, getting the surrender of the first one, leaping across with a boarding party to the second, and taking the surrender of that. Big heroic stuff. The Admiral in charge of the fleet wrote his report to the Admiralty, and in Nelson's view, didn't big up Nelson. Nelson didn't feature as strongly as he could have done. So what did Nelson do? Well, he wrote his own account of the battle and sent it to the press, who publicized it. Nelson suddenly becomes a national hero. That's the start of his period of influence. We can then go on to sort of 1798, when we had the Battle of the Nile, which is probably the most comprehensive naval victory of all, although not perhaps in the scale of things, not as important eventually as Trafalgar, but it was a massive victory. And it led to Nelson becoming internationally famous. I think not long afterwards he met Lady Hamilton, who swooned at his feet, so they say. But this was the period when he was becoming recognised and actually became influential. So we can test Afua Hirsch's argument again, because in that period from 1797 to 1805, when he was killed, Nelson was almost exclusively in the European theatre of war. He wasn't involved in the West Indies, apart from a short period in 1805 when he chased the French fleet across the Atlantic. So we know that he wasn't using his position of influence to perpetuate the crimes, really, that she was talking about. Just one little footnote, though. He did try and use his influence in two respects. One, he managed to secure the release of some slaves, some Portuguese slaves who were some Turkish slaves who were being held by the Portuguese. Mm-hmm. And then he also tried to get the government to allow him to intervene in the Barbary slave trade. He really wanted to go along and take the gunboats to Tunis and Algiers because there was a horrible trade going on. He called it a horrid war. So he was trying. I think the evidence suggests that he was doing the reverse of what Afua Hirsch is alleging.
Indeed, that wouldn't surprise us. Yeah.
The other issue that she raised, of course, was all the planter class being his friends. Well, he did have two tours of duty in the West Indies. Undoubtedly, he would have met planters and would have probably made friends with some of them. But I think the most telling information is that he met someone called Hercules Ross in the West Indies. And Hercules Ross became a very close friend, a Scot, a very, very close friend. And he spoke at the Parliamentary Commission against slavery. He was a strong abolitionist. And as I've said, Nelson became a very close friend. He stood as godfather for Hercules Ross's son. And I generally don't believe that friendship could have lasted had Nelson held the views and been guilty of the crimes that Afua Hirsch is alleging.
Absolutely. Well, that's interesting about Hercules Ross. I've never heard about that name, but it sounds like somebody that we should look into and maybe give some publicity to, because that's a very good connection, good angle.
Yeah. Can you still see me?
Yes. See you fine. Yeah.
I've lost you for the moment, but don't worry, we can continue.
Okay, you can hear me though.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Hear you fine.
Yeah. Good. Well, so in other words, Afua Hirsch is just talking out of her ears and talking nonsense. And any idea why she might be doing that?
I could be sort of slightly cynical and say it had nothing to do with the book that she was about to publish. Afua Hirsch is a very intelligent lady, and she's an excellent communicator. We did try to probe the basis for her allegations, and we've never had a response that deals with that particular claim. And I think the truth is that it was just trying to draw attention to an agenda. Nelson's column in London, of course, is literally the biggest target that you can have. So to bring Nelson into this debate meant that she was getting publicity for her broader arguments about issues of race in our modern society.
Aye, that's a very good answer to my question. Exactly why she was doing that, using it just as a kind of way of clickbait, as they say in the modern day society, just so that newspapers can put out historian thinks Nelson's column should be pulled down, and suddenly people are reading the article.
Sure.
Whereas if she had just said some kind of academic thing about the 19th century, the 18th century slave trade or something, nobody would have read her article at all. So yeah, that makes sense. But it's still a wee bit naughty to do that, I think. Whether that's it's almost like a kind of bad faith in a way, entering into it with an agenda to kind of misrepresent. So. But at least the good thing about it as well is your organisation has exercised yourself to get to the bottom and to get to the truth of it all, and you've learned more as a consequence and the Nelson
Correct.
Society has actually been enriched. And I should just give another plug to the Nelson Society actually at this moment. If you're interested, please do go to the website nelson-society.com. And how often do you publish your little journal?
That's a quarterly journal.
Quarterly?
Yes, 4 times a year. So we have 40 years worth of good research backing up in the society.
Yeah, well, each absolutely, and everything you could possibly want to know about not just Nelson, but people that he was associated with, places that he has been. What's the connection here at the front here with this wee boy? It's the boy who stood on the burning deck.
Burning deck, yes. That's the Battle of the Nile. The one of the ships at the Battle of the Nile took a heck of a beating, and the magazine blew up, and it was heard 25 miles away in Alexandria. But the story is that the boy's father was on the ship and down below decks, and the boy was waiting for him. And so you had the burning deck and the young lad waiting for him.
Goodness me. Those were astonishing days when you just had very young children as well would be on the ship.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Have you ever seen the film Master and Commander?
I certainly have. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a great film, but something that I just was stunned by was one of the officers on the ship is like a 12-year-old boy or something like that, and he's ordering all these like rough men around in his kind of posh accent. I thought it was the strangest thing. It really was. But wonderful stuff, you know.
Absolutely, and Nelson became the youngest captain in the Navy. He was the youngest captain, and I think that's a record that he still holds, which is actually quite incredible, because when you're a captain, you're in charge of the ship and everything that goes with it.
Absolutely. Well, adult humans seem to have matured a lot earlier back then, you know, and William Pitt the Younger as well became Prime Minister at the age of, was it 21? I think it was. Yeah. And he was Prime Minister, of course, of different social circumstances, different social classes and that sort of stuff. But I sometimes hear people today go, oh, talking about MPs or something, she's only 24, what does she know? Or, you know, and it's like, well, do you know the first Prime Minister was 21, and he was also he liked a bevy, as they say, William Pitt the Younger did. So you can't say that the people in Parliament are too young today when you've had Prime Ministers at age 21. Anyway, different times. But to go back to the Nelson research, now, did she say something about what was the story with the document that? Hang on, with let me just bring it out here. I've got. It was claimed that Nelson had written a letter. Let's talk about this, where he essentially advocated the maintenance of slavery, and you looked into this. So take that from the top, because this is a really interesting thing that you guys have uncovered, and it made national news.
I'll take you through the sort of the sequence, because it's a little bit of a detective story, if you like.
Yes, good. We've got all the time you need.
Okay. In 1805, in June 1805, Nelson and his fleet were chasing the French and Spanish fleet across the Atlantic to the West Indies. Nelson was desperately keen to bring that fleet to battle. He was quite frustrated in trying to track them down in the end, and of course it wasn't until October 1805 that he was able to finally engage them at Trafalgar. But in June, in the West Indies, he was sitting in his cabin in HMS Victory, and he penned a letter to a long-standing acquaintance in Jamaica. And I say acquaintance rather than close friend, but this acquaintance was a very wealthy and influential person on Jamaica. He was a major slave owner, I think over 2,000 slaves. And he was one of the wealthiest people on the island, which made him one of the wealthiest people in Britain at the time, within what you might call the empire. Mm-hmm. In that letter, Nelson expressed support for the colonial system, and he was rather less than complimentary about William Wilberforce. Now, that was what Nelson was writing, and I think historians have taken that phrase about the colonial system and have equated it to the slave trade. Now, for reasons which I'll explain, I don't think that that was the case. Let's roll forward a couple of hundred years, and at the end of 2018, so a year after Afua Hirsch's article in The Guardian, we then had another article written by an eminent historian, Professor Krista Petley from Southampton University, who was an expert on Simon Taylor, this Jamaican planter. And he published an article in the BBC History magazine suggesting that Nelson's letter showed Nelson supported the slave trade. But, and here's where it starts to get interesting, his article relied on a version of the letter which had been published in something called the Political Register in 1807. So 18 months after Nelson's death, his letter was being published by William Cobbett in the Political Register. Cobbett was a well-known anti-abolitionist, i.e. pro-slavery, although he's quite a radical in other areas, supporting British labourers and so on. So it's quite an interesting sort of situation there. But the intent was very clear. By publishing this letter, the pro-slavery lobby were trying to use Nelson's, what was by then a considerable posthumous reputation, to persuade politicians to their cause. Mm-hmm. So, okay. Now, the other interesting thing about the timing, that letter was published in February 1807, 1 month before the debates in Parliament about the abolition of the slave trade. So it's very clear what was happening. Now, as a result of Professor Petley's article, which for a lot of us, again, in the Nelson Society, we were thinking, crumbs, is this really what the situation was? We started to evaluate and undertake a detailed analysis of the letter to see whether the conclusions were valid, mm-hmm. and to see whether Nelson had that dark side. As I said, that allegation has not been made in any of the books that we read, over the last 200 years. Nothing about this has been said. Now, at about the same time, there's a very eminent Nelson historian and collector of Nelson artifacts, Martin Downer, who was working with me on the analysis of the letter. He came across a manuscript version of the letter which differed from the one that had been published in 1807. Oh, yeah. Now, the important feature of that letter, which was originally put aside as a curiosity, for a reason I'll explain, was that it was not in Nelson's handwriting. Now, Nelson lost his arm in 1797. Before that, he had lovely copperplate handwriting. After that, slightly more spidery, as I'll show you. But the manuscript copy of the letter bore a Nelson seal and a copy of his signature. So I'm just going to show you that. So this is that forged letter. Now look at the handwriting. Okay, that's the false seal, or the seal. And then on the second page of the letter, okay, just bear with me, you might be able to make out Nelson's signature. Can you just see Nelson's signature?
Yes.
Just here, Nelson and Bronte. Okay. Yep. So it's a bit of a curiosity. But if I tell you that Nelson's handwriting at the time looked like this, right. Not beautiful copperplate or anything of the sort. And if we just go up to the signature, you probably you wouldn't be able to see the differences, but there are clear differences between the manuscript copy of the letter that we had and Nelson's handwriting. Yes. And this really raised our suspicions that perhaps either Cobbett's version or the manuscript version, which were not consistent, didn't actually reflect what Nelson had written. Mm-hmm. But of course, our problem was, where's the original letter? And I think we weren't sure, so we were trying to uncover that original letter. But it became very clear to us that there are a number of versions of this letter. Books published in the later 19th century had different versions of the letter, so we really needed to get to the original. And then last year we came across a reference to a collection of Nelson letters in the British Library. Now these are what are called pressed letters. And if I can just explain that, captains or admirals on their boats would write their letters, and once they were written, they would put a sheet of tissue paper, damp tissue paper, on top of the letter, lift the letter, the tissue paper up, and then place it on thicker paper, and you could then read what had been originally written. It was an early form of photocopying.
Okay, yeah.
So we wanted to get to those letters.
Sure.
Unfortunately, national pandemic hit. I know you were discussing that earlier, and access was denied to the manuscript section of the library for a long time. But late summer last year, we were able to get to that collection, and we found the pressed copy of the original letter, which then set us free to compare the subsequent copies that we'd found in print, Cobbett's version in his political register, and this manuscript version.
Right. That's amazing.
Well, it was quite a lot of hard work, and it sounds make it sound simple, but getting to that original was the vital.
It must have been exciting. When you saw it and you thought, "This is it," that must have been like, "Whoa, history in my hands."
It was absolutely brilliant, and the most important thing is when we did the comparisons, we found that the manuscript copy, Cobbett's copy, were different in a number of respects. There were 25 changes to the original letter and some additions. So
wow.
we're convinced that what was happening was that the pro-slavery lobby were forging Nelson's letter in their favour to influence the debates in Parliament. We can now prove that effectively.
Exactly.
We think the original was destroyed because I think it would be embarrassing had that original turned up. Right. And I would tell you that I think there's a lot more in this story to come out because our research is continuing, and we will bring that all together and publish more next year.
Good.
But it was quite some. What I would say is that historians, though, have used the forged versions of the letter in making their articles and reports, and it looks like the pro-slavery lobby have had a little bit of victory. They've been influencing Nelson's character, contrary to the way they wanted to, 200 years on.
Yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like, and that's I'm so glad that you've used this time to put the real story out. And I know back in no doubt shortly after you'd made all these discoveries on October the 13th, 2020, the Daily Mail published this article, yes. Does this doctored letter sink claims Nelson backed slavery? And that's the research there that you've just been describing to us. And that's a really good that's a really good piece of work, and that's just shows the value of organizations such as yourself who are committed to a particular point of view and will try to get to the bottom of things.
Sure.
So well done. I mean, you deserve heartiest congratulations as an organization for what you did there. Absolutely. What do you think's the next move on this? Have you got more what more is there for you to research on this particular issue?
Well, a couple of things. One of the problems that we face, I think, as you were saying at the top of the show, we have bad history, and that tends to get used in good faith by organisations. And I think it might just be interesting for your viewers to hear about what the Welsh Assembly have done. We have the Welsh Assembly, basically the government of Wales. They produced a consultation last year called The Slave Trade in the British Empire, an Audit of Commemorations in Wales. And Nelson features. He has 31 commemorations, statues or streets named after him, or buildings or whatever. And when you look at their documents, they say that Nelson is known from private correspondence to have opposed the abolition of the slave trade, though he doesn't appear to have done so publicly. So they're relying on the forged letters that we are talking about, firstly.
Yes.
The reason they include Nelson in the debate is because of the Topple the Racists website, the Black Lives Matters website. Now, the evidence that we're referred to in looking at the validity of including Nelson is the Dark Side article by Krista Petley, based on a corrupted version of the letter. But it also refers us to another website. And sorry, this might sound a little bit esoteric, but it's very important. It shows you how history can be misused. You get referred to a website which is run by the University College London, the database of the legacies of the British slave trade, where they've documented all the people who received financial compensation once slavery was abolished in 1834, I think. You're directed to one particular page where Horatio Nelson claims for a slave. Now, you can imagine, we look at that and suddenly all our theories appear to be blown out of the water. Nelson's claim for a slave. Until we looked at it rather more closely, and we realized that the claim was made in 1836. Now, by my reckoning, Nelson had been dead 31 years, so he couldn't have been making the claim. And then we realized it was someone with the same name. And in those days, there are lots of children called Horatio, lots of them called Nelson, because they were paying tribute to the hero.
Yes.
So it shows that you have to really disentangle carefully the history, because someone on the face of it has taken that and said, oh, look, Nelson got compensation for a slave. He didn't. It was wrong. And yet that's in print, and someone else will carry that forward. So that's the sort of issue that we're facing, and we have to be vigilant on it all the time.
Absolutely. That's the nature of history, is it can be so misinterpreted, and just often by accident as well, without people giving it the further thought. You know, you talk about Wales, the Welsh Assembly doing all of that. Edinburgh, which I was referring to at the start of the segment there, are run by the SNP, and for some reason they got it into their heads to do the same thing with Edinburgh. Now, Edinburgh is a great city that's full of history, and somebody no doubt has been contracted, or a group of people no doubt contracted on a very nice salary to do quite a nice job, which is probably walking about all of Edinburgh, noting the street names that are related to British history, which no doubt has a certain valuable function. But of course, they're doing it because they're trying to befoul and dump on, as I like to say, British history, and they've got a public consultation open at the minute, which I actually spent a couple of hours going through, and then I guess next year they're going to publish the findings of that. And what struck me about it, though, is it's called the Edinburgh Slavery and Colonialism Legacy Review. Now, what they're doing here, and what the questions do, is that they make an equivalence between slavery and colonialism and the British Empire. Three things that the people who have put this together obviously think are wrong. Well, I think we can all agree that slavery is wrong, and that Britain has redeemed itself many years ago regarding that. But as for colonialism and the British Empire, these are different debates, and there's rights and wrongs of both of those things, and many of us, obviously, we are very supportive of the British Empire, generally speaking. So, but what they're doing is they're just piling that in. It's like slavery equals the British Empire equals colonialism equals slavery equals the British Empire, as if it's all one, and it's not. It's three different topics. And I tried to make that point in my responses by pointing out that there is no moral equivalence between colonialism per se, or the British Empire per se, and slavery per se. These are different historical matters, and the two are not on the same moral plane. They're not on the same moral plane. For example, colonialism can be demonstrated to have had morally good elements, and so, but to imagine that it's as bad as slavery, or that it automatically leads to slavery, isn't and wasn't the case. All they're doing there is attacking Britain's general history for their own particular reasons. And as I alluded to earlier, especially the SNP don't like that element of British history, which historian Professor Tom, academic Professor Tom Gallagher has said their aim is to delegitimize episodes and people from the wider consciousness especially from the age of achievement in Scotland that characterised much of the 3 centuries of parliamentary union.
Yeah.
So basically everything around Glasgow with the British name, they want to delegitimise it, even though that involves Scottish people, overwhelmingly so, which just shows there's a strange bunch of folk, and but they really do take it to every level. And then they'll say, "There's somebody in here." Let me just see. They were even accusing physicians. There's some street name named after a doctor who trained at Edinburgh and went to practice medicine on colonial plantations. So he's linked.
Yes,
He's linked
yes.
to slavery when he's actually a doctor practicing medicine and no doubt helping some enslaved people to get better as well. And then there's another. Graduates from Edinburgh were to be found in positions of importance in many of the colonies of the British Empire. Oh, how terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, of course they were. Of course they were.
Yes.
And I say, so what? You know, is that meant to be a bad thing?
Yeah.
But for them, it is a bad thing.
I think there is one point that came out in our research. I was initially very concerned when Nelson said he's a great friend to the present colonial system, because the immediate rush, as you say, is to equate that with slavery, for example. I think Nelson was very clear when he wrote his letter. He was very careful when he wrote letters, and he was clear not to say that he supported the slave trade or the slavery system, because he had supported an idea for paid labor, ironically paid Chinese labor, in the colonies. That had been promoted by one of his captains, and he was behind that proposal. And he wasn't the only the captain in the Navy wasn't the only person promoting those sort of ideas, which Nelson would have been aware of. But just on the point, I think that the politicians and the people of the time were able to distinguish between the two. William Pitt's Prime Minister, William Wilberforce, neither of them advocated the removal of the colonies. They were keen to abolish the slave trade, but not the colonial system. And they were trying to find a way to make the colonial system work. So yeah, I think that they were able to do it 200 years ago. I think what we've done now is conflated the two. And that's just led to this rush of bad history.
Absolutely conflated the two.
Yeah.
Chris, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. I'm glad to say we've gone longer than we had originally intended, just because it was so interesting and fascinating what you were saying. And what we'll probably do as well, we'll maybe take this particular video and upload it to YouTube in the coming weeks as an actual episode itself, because it's so educational. So I just want to say to people, please do consider, if you like, becoming a member of the Nelson Society. And thank you very much to your work, Chris. Thank you for coming on, and please, we'll speak to you again, no doubt, in the course of the year. So thanks for everything that you've done.
Okay. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. Okay, good afternoon.
And you. Cheers.